Hey, good morning. Yeah, thank you for that song. These are trying times. like impeachments and um, truths and half-truths and UN climate reports and protests and, well, everything you've been addicted to the last few weeks. How many of you honestly feel addicted to the news? Yeah. The rest of you are lying. So we know your addictions. Yeah, and I've been thinking a bit about this. And the way Facebook works is they have algorithms. And that's a fancy way of saying I don't really know what an algorithm is, but I know roughly how it functions in that it collects up your information, your tastes, and spits them back at you. That's why why you like your Facebook feed and or hate it. Same thing. It's because whatever hooks you, they know how to toss that back in your face so that it keeps the cycle going. And it's not just now your Facebook feed, because that's fun to pick on. It's your news feed too if you have a phone or any kind of computer that you use regularly. In other words, it knows I know you think you're a free-thinking individual and you're just choosing these articles, and no, they're being given to you because your tastes are combed through by these special algorithms. So what happened to me the last couple weeks is I was pumped full of all kinds of information about the global climate strike because Facebook knows that's the kind of thing I like. And I started noticing something, that the material that was coming out of I'm trying to think of the right category, those who support whatever, let's just say the global climate strike. We'll keep it that simple. The kind of information, the videos, and the data points were rooted in something very specific. And it's what I'm calling, the title of today's talk is Turn or Burn, okay? If you don't change, now you're gonna die. That's the basic orientation. That's the basic emotional ground. Facts aside, it's the emotional ground. How do we know? Because everything I clicked on was, if you don't change, you're gonna die. And so is everybody else. And how soon? As soon as 50 years, it's all over. Now, how many of you agree there are things to be alarmed by in terms of the way we're living on the planet? Okay. How many of you are contributing to that? Okay. So the reason why this works is, the reason why it hooks us is because we know we're contributing to the future, and the future doesn't look so good, right? Now, let's go back to Einstein. No problem can be solved by the same consciousness that created it. I love saying that, and I have to admit, just because I know that phrase doesn't mean I have a different consciousness. I remember one of my professors at Hebrew University used to say, human beings do not live on quotations alone. And then for years I quoted him, Seriously, like I just did. Okay, so no problem can be solved by the same consciousness that created it. I want to be clear here, and you are free to disagree, as you always are. And I'll find out about it in the talkback. The same consciousness that says, if you don't change your way, you're all going to burn, is the same consciousness that I grew up with in Christian fundamentalism. If you don't change, you're all going to die. And worse, you're going to burn in hell. It's the same apocalyptic mentality rooted in fear. That's the level of consciousness. Let's take facts aside. I don't think in Christian apocalyptic roadmaps that Jesus is going to fly down from the clouds and then there's going to be famine and nuclear war and all the different things. I don't think that's going to happen, factually. When it comes to climate change, I think we have some things to be worried about in the future. So let's leave the facts aside. I want to talk about the consciousness for a second. And I want to ask you a question. How many of you have really deeply transformed out of fear? Really? I know. Some of you are like, well, man, it does work. Does it really work? Does it help people grow up? Transform, grow up, evolve. Move to a higher level of... Can you, using fear, force your children into a higher level of consciousness? Okay. So, what's my first point? The turn or burn is a kind of literalism that both sides share. The far right Christian fundamentalist apocalyptic vision, rooted also in fear, and the far left apocalyptic, I might add, literalistic vision of the future also can be rooted in fear. Scientists aren't generally rooted in fear. I mean, they're just gathering facts, supposedly. But you know what I'm saying. A fact is a fact, right? You're just gathering evidence. And actually, most of what passes as climate science is also prediction-oriented. We don't know exactly. We say, here's what we think is happening, and we don't know exactly how the climate is going to respond, but here's a range of possibilities. How that gets used, though, is what I'm talking about. So, why am I bringing this up? Because it's fun. and I want, in part, I want to challenge us. Do we want to root what we're doing in fear? That's a genuine question. It's easy. It's always the easy way. It's always the easy way. Be afraid. It's contagious. And we happen to know that that's the way the news media runs things. It's rooted in the same consciousness, is what I'm saying. That's why we're addicted to it. Because fear is part of the limbic system. It's not like you can ever rise above it anyway. I mean, you can be all enlightened and go to yoga and all this stuff, but, you know, in the parking lot, if someone scares you, you're not going to be like, oh, yeah, I'm just all one. You're going to be like, ah, you know, because it's part of the limbic system and it's our most primal. And I'm not saying we're not more complex than that. We are more complex than that. But what I'm saying is what tends to feed us is fear on both sides. And you just have to ask yourself, is that how I want to be? Do I think that's going to work? Is turn or burn the best way of approaching these things? Because usually what happens when I'm arguing with someone about the future of the climate and they say, I don't believe in climate change or something like that, and I use all kinds of threats, I always win the argument. And they change their mind and they say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. See what I mean? All right, so the theme for the month. This is connected to the theme for the month, I think. I'm going to try to. I've got good news and bad news. And you can decide which is which. So I'm not teaching for the next 3 weeks. We have some amazing guests coming. So that's either good news or bad news, depending. But also, I'm trying to fit, 3 weeks of stuff into 1 week. So I've got a lot to say. I'm going to cram all this in. And so if you don't get it all, no problem. That's what the podcast is for, or YouTube, or Facebook. It's going to tell you, like this. And if you don't, be afraid. Okay, so our theme for the month is common humanity. And let me just read to you. So if you're new to C3, we have values. And values are sort of like the zodiac. Like they guide us in some way. We look up and it helps orient where we are. I don't mean the zodiac like your horoscope. I meant like the constellations. Maybe that's a better way to say it. They're like constellations. And we look up like the North Star and we say, oh yeah, that's right. I'd like to be pointed in this direction. So listen to how we've worded common humanity. We respect the dignity and worth of every individual. We respect the dignity and worth of every individual. How many of you would like to aspire to that? Okay. I won't ask you how many of you live this out every day. Because it's aspirational, would you agree? And would you also agree that something like this would help the culture of fear we live in right now? To respect the dignity and worth of every individual. That'd be nice. So we've got a long ways to go. And usually, one way of going about respecting the dignity and worth of every human being is to use a lot of fear. That was supposed to be a joke. Leslie laughed a little bit. It usually doesn't lead us down that path. Actually, fear almost always leads to the opposite. And this is what I mean by turn or burn. And I want to be subtle here. Actually, I want to be direct. I'll be direct. In Christian fundamentalism, here are the unconscious psychological motivations at work. You don't believe what I believe, and there are going to be consequences for this. And because of this, you don't deserve to make it into the future with God. In other words, let's go even deeper. You do not deserve to be a part of this planet. And God's going to take care of that in due time. Sounds pretty frightening, right? Okay, so let's change gears. You, because of your capitalism, glut, and abuse of the earth, don't deserve to be on this planet because of your worldview. It would be better if you were not here. See how it's the same thing? And that comes out sometimes when you hear human beings, capitalist human beings are a cancer on the planet. What do you do with a cancer? Okay, it's the same. Do you hear how it's the same thing? Nobody really wants to admit that, but they're not too far off, at least in my view. If you disagree, tell somebody else other than me. All right, so common humanity. We respect the dignity and worth of every individual. So a few thoughts on history. One of the things I wanted to do, I'll try to do as we move through these 6 months is, because the overall series I called Ancient Virtues, Modern Values, because there's a continuum here. And human beings have always wrestled with virtues, values, the good. What is the good life? That's part of the C3's makeup. That's a Greek question, you know? I mean, it's not like we invented that. So it's important to have a conversation about that continuum. So just real quick on Aristotle. Aristotle says, where does he say this? Dignity consists not in possessing honors, but in the consciousness that we deserve them. This is a line from Aristotle. What's he saying is that dignity does not come externally. That's a pretty important shift. He's saying dignity comes where? From within. Okay, he's going in the direction of self-worth, which was kind of a radical idea, especially in a Greek culture that worshipped fame, really, in a way. And especially the Romans more than the Greeks, but wanting a kind of eternal fame, even with their tombstones. This is my self-worth is going to last forever in the eyes of my fellow human beings, and so hence all these monuments. Aristotle's, digging around in that and saying that doesn't work that way. It comes from within. So now that's easier said than done. It's not like everybody went, "Oh, you're right, Aristotle," and they moved on. Okay. So around the same time period, you have some lines from the Hebrew Bible, which is interesting. Listen to it. You've heard it before. Love your neighbor. Okay? Hear how it's the same thing? In other words, if you do not love yourself, is it possible to love your neighbor? If you actually have disdain for yourself, what is more likely to happen? You will have disdain for. And before Carl Jung came along and Freud, to call that something, this is digging around it. What did they call it? They called that projection. I'm putting onto someone else what I can't face in myself. Love your neighbor as yourself. That is a difficult thing in both respects. How do I treat myself? How do I have a kind of self-worth? That's why probably at some point in your life you've had a therapist. Correct? Easier said than done. I just think it's interesting that this conversation started 3,000 years ago, or in the case of Aristotle, 2,300 years ago. What else might I say about antiquity? By the way, Jesus is the one that pushes this even further because he's asked about love your neighbor as yourself, and he tells a story. And I won't tell you the whole story, but it's the parable of the Good Samaritan. That starts with the question, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? That's what the person wants to know. I know it says love your neighbor as yourself. The person says, well, who's my neighbor? Who qualifies? Only people that you approve on your Facebook feed. That's your neighbor. I'll love them. See, tribalism, we're not so far from it, correct? I know we think we are. Oh, I'm not a part of a tribe. We're part of global humanity. BS, Instinctually, we often get caught in these tribalistic tendencies. Anyway, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the conclusion to that, because Jesus asks the question at the end, who is my neighbor? And the man has to say, it's the Samaritan. So Jesus is poking around in, your enemy even qualifies as your neighbor. And nobody likes to hear that, really. So this is not a new conversation. And it's not like we've evolved all that much. This is something that's difficult to live into, to respect the dignity and worth of every human being. Like you're saying in your song, these are trying times. We know we need to love our brother and our sister. It's hard. And the things in our culture fight against it by creating further divisions. So, all right, I told you I was going to pack a lot in. Let's talk about consciousness. Let's talk about stages of consciousness. And don't worry, there's not going to be a test. I'm just going to walk you through a few of stages of consciousness so you can see how they work. And largely I'm using Ken Wilber here. I just want to talk about 4. And I'm just picking the ones in the middle. There are lower levels of consciousness, and there are even higher levels of consciousness. So I want to talk about the 4 that I think are most relevant, and you'll see why and how that relates to how we treat other human beings. So we're going to start with what Ken Wilber calls the magic level of consciousness. Magic. So in the magic level of consciousness, there's a very poor differentiation between subject and object, between I and other. Even I and other when it comes to a tree or a plant or a flower or a stone. This is where you get more animistic religions. He calls that the more magic stage. So there's a blurring of the lines there. There's less of a sense of an individual. You can't get to respecting the dignity and worth of every individual because the individual hasn't emerged yet in the magic layer of consciousness. Now, don't think you're above it. The way consciousness works is like a spiral. It goes up like this. You have that down in there. And I'll give you an example of it in a second. So what else could we say? It's egocentric, the magic level of consciousness. It tends to be narcissistic. The whole world orients around the I and then a blurring of I and the other. You can't really get out of that, you might say. It has a bit of the sense of the superhero vibe. Okay, superheroes can glance over at a tree and uproot it and move it. That is magic level consciousness. It's actually a lower level of consciousness. I know we think they're awesome and we'll pay hundreds of millions of dollars to make movies like that, but it's magic level consciousness. I can look at something and uproot it and plant it over there and then watch me fly. Okay, magic level consciousness. And it tends to think that by doing certain little rituals, I can manipulate the world. We say, oh, nobody believes that. Have you ever been to a sports fan's home? Seriously. People believe that if they wear a certain hat, their team will win or lose. And we thought, that's silly. It's not silly. We are drawn into it. How many of you have actually thought, I have to admit some things, but like, let's say it was a game I was really into and I wanted the team to win. I have thought before, if I didn't watch the game, would they have won? That's magic consciousness. Seriously. And you have it. Now, thankfully, you don't have to get stuck there. It's not the only. There was a time when the dominant consciousness of of entire cultures or the planet, in terms of human beings, was rooted in magic level consciousness. The next layer above that, see? I said magic and it did that, and see, I'm manipulating the world. Stop doing that. Okay, the next layer is the mythic, what he calls... Yeah, exactly. I don't know my own parts. C3 is a cult, you know. Magic, by the way, magic level of consciousness is how we get cults, because we think the leader has magic powers, really. And with his or her magic touch or doing certain things, it's going to manipulate the world in a certain way. The next layer of consciousness, I don't want to spend too much time here because I'm starting to get excited. Go fast. All right. Is mythic. And that's where we get a lot of the ancient religions. It takes it less out of the individual and says, I can't manipulate the world, but the gods can. So it turns from little magic rituals to prayers or sacrifices in order to get the gods to rip up the tree and move it and plant it over there. Does that make sense? It shifts the focus of power, less into the individual, into the realm of the gods. And that's where we get most of what we would call the world religions are coming up out of mythic consciousness. And there's nothing wrong with myths. You hear me using them all the time. That's a slightly separate conversation. I'm just talking about the layer of consciousness. What else could we say? It's very concrete and literal, mythic is. In other words, like it says in the book of Joshua that the sun stood still in the sky, actually so they could keep killing people. It's kind of a dark passage. But that phrase in mythic literal consciousness would not be seen as a symbol, like, oh, the sun stood still, as if this day could last forever. No, they meant literally the sun stood still and the gods made it happen. Okay? Mythic literal consciousness. Now, just as a side note, do you think such a consciousness still exists in our... Okay. Mythic literal consciousness, very much. Still prevalent. And you're not above it. You have it too. You know? Do some self-examination in terms of the mythic literal. Still, just as a side note, tribalism is still king in both of these worlds. My tribe. You know, especially in the mythic literal. We have the right God. We have the right rituals and prayers, and they don't. That's what Carl Jung is poking around in that quote that I gave you earlier. The next layer of consciousness is the rational. Okay? It drops the mythic, literal, in terms of stories and replaces that with evidence. It's still literal, but it has to be evidence-based. That's a revolution in consciousness. Would you agree? Are you glad such a thing has happened to humanity? Yes, because we have antibiotics, thanks to this level and layer of consciousness. By the way, it's still pretty low. If I were to do the math, according to Ken Wilber, there are still 6 more layers of higher consciousness. I know we think rational is way up there, but it's really not. So here's a way of putting it. If you want something, you're going to have to understand it and then do it yourself. How many of you have thought that? Welcome to this layer of consciousness. You have arrived. Doesn't mean you still won't wear some funny hat so your team wins, because it's a fluid thing. Okay, so this is the mythic, this is the rational. Miracles don't exist in rational consciousness. You can't manipulate the cosmos. Einstein, you don't play dice. God doesn't play dice with the universe. Famous quote. I have no idea what he means by that. It's a lovely image. I think it has something to do with the rational approach. Science is born. It's still very much in an us versus them framework. It just shifts it from those who are scientifically minded, rational, and objective, and those who aren't. Still the same kind of tribalism. So one more layer of consciousness level, which Ken Wilber calls vision logic. All right? Now listen to the way he describes vision logic. Vision logic is a synthesizing and unifying mode of cognition. Do you know how rational is much more, it's divided and categorizing and separateness, and that's the way the objective works, evidence. Vision logic is a synthesizing and unifying mode of cognition. It looks down the pipe at the other layers of consciousness or levels of consciousness or modes of being and synthesizes them, brings them up. It's where you get phrases like transcend and include. You start picking up. Instead of saying, I'm done with that, it begins to synthesize things. You have probably experienced this. Have you ever talked with someone that really is from the other side and all of a sudden you realize, actually, you do connect on a couple of different things? And you're kind of surprised by that? Tell me that's happened to you. If not, you need some other friends. That's that synthesizing mode of cognition at work. It's a level of consciousness. All of a sudden, your categories, they drop a bit. And you're like, oh, okay, I actually see where this person's coming from. And I can synthesize a bit of their worldview. It celebrates diversity. You would never get such a thing in the mythic and the magical levels of consciousness. So vision logic celebrates diversity. And it believes something like, what did I put? That you achieve, here's the irony of it, that you achieve a kind of unity, which we need more of, would you agree? Achieve a kind of unity by embracing differences. That is easier said than done. Embracing differences, not ignoring them. That passes as thin unity. I'm just going to ignore our differences, and then we're going to pretend at the community potluck. That's not unity. Correct? Well, we don't talk about God or politics with so-and-so. That's not unity. That's just denial. All right? So it's going into differences. And I first bumped into this when I was a graduate student, because very first opening class at Hebrew University, we're sitting there, and the professors, there were two professors in this class I took. I was in the comparative religion department, and they said, we want to start off by saying this to you. In America and in Europe, there is a lie going on. They love to be provocative. And the lie is that all religions are saying the same thing, and that comparative religion is just a fun time that we're all just saying the same thing. He's like, they're not. And the only way to achieve any kind of unity is to go into our differences. So, welcome to the Hebrew University, where we are going to celebrate the fact that religions are not saying the same thing. And there are subtle differences. Now, that made it more exciting, for one thing. But it is actually rooted in this kind of vision logic consciousness. And you know what ended up happening? Because in class, I had a Russian Orthodox priest with a black robe. I had some Orthodox Jews. I had some Christians. We had other people that were just confused like me. And here we are. And the deeper we went into various traditions and saw the differences, the easier it was to say, oh, I see we have a connection. There's a unifying field at work here. Do you feel the paradox? Now, it's a higher level of consciousness, and let's just admit most people are not there. And let's just admit you're not there much of the time, nor I, honestly, really. Especially if you're addicted to the news. Because the news knows nothing about unity in diversity. It's just division and fear. So David White, forget the news, he says. Forget it. Well, he's just being metaphoric. He's a poet. No, he means it. Forget the news. Forget the blurred screen and the radio. Anyway. Okay, so here's my question at this point. How do you move? I mean, I love conversations about higher levels of consciousness, but how do you move? How do you continue to evolve? And like I said, there are 4 other ones above this, which they tend to be a little more mystical. We won't get into them. That's another next year, maybe. How do you move? And I don't know the answer to that question. I wish it was, give me $50 and I'll bump up your consciousness. It's complicated, but I'll give you 2 suggestions. One is humility. That we move actually with humility. And I'll use some Carl Jung here. Listen to what he says. The revolution in our conscious outlook brought about by the catastrophic results of World War. In other words, you think you're so high and mighty? We just had 2 world wars. And you think war has ceased since World War II? I mean, let's update it for the modern era. How many years have we been at war in Afghanistan? 18 years? Not to mention the covert war we were having there before the war. And the Russian war. That's kind of what I was hinting at. Okay, now we're just listing wars. Okay. Shows itself by our inner life, by shattering our faith in ourselves and our own worth. It's humiliating. You think you're so enlightened? Let what our taxes pay for shatter this illusion that we're so evolved. So anyway, he says, we used to regard foreigners as political and reprobates, but the modern person is forced to recognize that he is politically and morally just like anyone else. That is humility. That's humbling. I guess I'm not so great. Whereas formerly I believed it was my bounded duty to call others to order. How many of you love to do that? Oh man, just give me a chance and I'll set you right. Now, must admit that I need calling to order myself and that I would do better to set my own house to rights first. Sound like somebody? I know, Jesus. Take the plank out of your own eye before you take the speck of dust out of your brothers or sisters. So, that's part of how we, I think, submit to the evolution of consciousness that's at work. That's always possible. The other, I might say, is that we must stay hungry, this is the metaphor, for depth. We must stay hungry for depth. Some of you are looking at me like, what the heck does that mean? Just think, without me explaining it, stay hungry for depth. Depth. Death? Is that? Same thing. Stay hungry for death. Actually, now thank you for mishearing me. Stay hungry for death and depth. So staying hungry for death means you're not going to live forever. And actually, that makes life precious and meaningful, doesn't it? It's the fact that there is a limit that makes love possible. That's that hunger for depth. The depth dimension of life itself. And I'm telling you, you know it and I know it. Nothing on Twitter has any depth. Nothing. Not a single word, unless you reorder them into a poem. Virtually. I actually can't prove that. I've not read all of the tweets that have ever happened. But where's the depth? Anywhere. Where's the depth on the ticker at the bottom of the screen? You know, maybe the next line will prove that Trump is guilty of whatever. It's just, that's the kind of craving for a shallowness. You stay hungry for depth. You're dissatisfied with the shallow. You're dissatisfied with your own ideological camp, whatever that may be. Do you think it answers all the questions for you? I'm so happy I'm a hippie, green, liberal communist. I've arrived. No, just some dissatisfaction. How can an ideology or any kind of identity sum me up, or anybody else for that matter? Forget the news, forget the radio, forget the blurred screen. This is not the age of information. This is the time of loaves and fishes. And one good word is bread for 1,000. That's the poem. One good word is bread for 1,000. Aren't you hungry for that kind of word? So, I'll get very practical. What am I saying here? Let's first of all assume you cannot do a nonstop flight from low levels of consciousness to common humanity and the dignity and worth of every human being. Everything is a process. Everything takes time. Everything is an evolution. You think evolution is fast? I mean, come on. Things take time. And you can't get on a flight, watch some Netflix documentary about enlightened consciousness and then land over there. Things take time. And we can't live with such illusions. So, humbling ourselves, staying hungry for depth, here are the practices that I'm suggesting. Follow the news by a poem. How do you stay hungry for depth and death? You follow the news with a poem. You say, okay, I read the news. What does Mary Oliver have to say now? Here's another one. Follow Netflix by art. Now you could say, well, there's a form of art. Okay. I'm still saying follow Netflix by art. What does Caravaggio have to say on darkness and light? See, depth is around us. I think we have to stay hungry for it. Otherwise, fear will run the ship. Here's another one. Follow Twitter by silence. Silence is very hard right now, especially in nonstop action and news, because we feel like we're going to miss something. Right? Last week I was in Seattle, and I did a retreat in the Cascades. So I was gone for 3 days, no cell phone coverage. It's amazing that you can go to places in America and not get cell phone. You're like, oh, this is a big place. And I still went out and checked every day. Well, maybe. Nothing. And you know what happened at the end of 3 days? What did I miss? Follow Twitter by silence. It's a way of staying hungry for depth. We're not going to get to the value, which I'll read again. We respect the dignity and worth of every individual if we don't sink into the depth dimension of our own life. So, follow news by poems or novels. I'm not much of a novel reader, but follow the news by East of Eden and see what happens. Follow Netflix by art. Follow Twitter by silence. Stay hungry for bread. That's what I got for you today.